everyone. On today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Philip Galea on. Now, Philip is from our product development team here at Hornetscurity, and he's going to be coming and talking to us today about immutability. Why is immutability so important in today's IT ecosystem? Well, why is it so important in the fight against ransomware? We're going to be talking about that and a whole lot more coming up on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Well, everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the insights and knowledge straight from the security lab here at Hornetsecurity. As always, I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and with me I've got Philip Galea today. How's it going, Phil?
Hey, Andy. How's it going? All good over here.
Doing good here. I appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us today, Phil. I know that, with version 9 of our backup product, right, our VM Backup product, you've done a lot of work with immutability. And, I'm thinking of topics for a security podcast, and immutability is one that always tends to come up, right? Because when we think about ransomware, one of the most pervasive issues in our industry today, right? Immutability is kind of one of our main weapons when it comes to that particular problem, right? So I thought, who better to come on the show and talk about immutability? So I'm really excited to have you on the show today, my friend. Good to have you.
I'm excited too. I mean, immutability is a really cool topic. When I first jumped into it, I'm like, as a backup provider, we had to figure out like what's the next step in our technology stack, and what is the most dangerous thing to backups, and what prevents you from restoring, and that's obviously ransomware. And immutability means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, from what I found out, and it took me a lot to test and get into. And I'm happy with the way it came out. But I'd really love to get into the nitty-gritty of this tech.
Yeah, definitely. So I guess before we dive in, really quick, just for our viewers that may not be familiar with who you are, can you give us just a quick introduction of who you are and kind of what your role is in the company?
Yes. So obviously, I mean, you've given me an introduction. My name's Philip, and I've been working with Hornetsecurity, and before that, Altaro for the last 7 years, and I've done a lot of different things, been in a lot of different departments. I started myself out and cut my teeth in tech support, and then sort of moved into IT and did the sysadmin, infra, and SecOps part of the job. And later on, and now I'm more into the product role and product strategy roles. So I've touched on a lot of different areas, a lot of different topics, and I found that especially when we were designing Immutable, it really helped to have a techie background and to know the dangers because I used to take care of our own backups here at Hornet. So I was the end user at the end of the day, and I felt the product in my hands, so I really felt I knew what made it feel good and what it needed once we came to decide V9.
Yeah, that makes all the difference in the world, right? Actually sitting in the chair of somebody that has to use this technology, right? That kind of helps me from a content perspective from time to time, because I spent a good chunk of my career actually in kind of the same thing, in the sysadmin, SecOps role, mostly for an MSP with a bunch of different customers and customer sizes. But definitely, to your point, it certainly helps when you have that perspective, right? So yeah. Well, I guess as we start looking at this topic, just to kind of set a baseline for all the listeners in today's episode, what is immutability, right? Can you kind of run us through what it is? I guess most people probably know it as hey, once a block is written, not even God can touch it, right? But, there's some caveats there, right? So I guess kind of walk us through, what is immutability really?
Yeah, so definitely 101 caveats. So as I started immutability, 101 different meanings on the internet and with other vendors and providers, storage providers, backup providers, you name it. I mean, the very basic English immutability means can't modify. Simple as that. And can't modify implies can't delete. But there are a lot of different ways that people can go about it and still technically call it immutability. Like one way is fiddling with permissions. Another way is only allowing one admin to manage that repository of data. And then there's also immutability as designed by storage providers, like with the APIs we're familiar with S3, for example, and also with some SAN providers as well. They allow you to set a block or to set files as immutable.
Right.
And over there, some more technology comes in where the blocks are actually sort of marked, and the file system can identify them and say no, it can't be deleted. So it's not just at the level of NTFS, for example, permissions or SMB, but it's also at the level on the storage, so on the SAN. But as I said, like a lot of different people just throw the word immutable around, and in reality, no, there is no one way that only God can delete a backup, because like
Right.
it only takes like one really angry sysadmin to go to find the SAN and pull out a disk. And
Well, I
so
know that we're going to get into that particular piece here a little bit further into the episode, but that's a good point, right? I mean, I see a lot of organizations, they look at immutability and think it's like a silver bullet. And don't get me wrong, it does solve a very large problem, in our industry. But, like any technology, depending on your goal, it may not do everything you're looking for it to do, right? Which I think is why it's important to really discuss immutability, what it is, what's the intended use case, and hence why we're having this episode, right?
yeah, so definitely. So like with security in general, I mean, you and I both have our own backgrounds and our own touch points on security, but we both know that security is a game of whack-a-mole. And not only that, but in reality, there is no 100% coverage. If you're targeted by someone, if someone really wants to like hack into your systems and damage you, they will eventually. It's
Right.
just a matter of time and effort. And money in reality. So like if a nation state decided to, I don't know, there was a vendor recently. I don't know if you heard about 3CX, but
Yep.
3CX is a VoIP company. They provide a system, just for listeners out there. They provide VoIP software, and they got hacked, and it was a supply chain attack, and they just released, sorry, Mandiant, who they hired to check out how they got hacked and to what level, has just released some initial findings this morning that it was North Korea, nation state North Korea. So, I mean, you have thousands of people, you have a bunch of money. Security is just about how much effort you throw at something.
Right.
And us, as sort of the sysadmins, the MSPs of the world, we are just the bastion, and we do the best that we can with the tools that we have and protect enough. So with immutable, it's just another tool in our tool set. So obviously it's not the silver bullet. It's not going to be the only thing you ever need, but it's an important
Right.
tool in your belt, just like backup is, like a decent antivirus is, like good email security, and especially like teaching your users, so user education. So it needs to be a very holistic approach when it comes to security. There is no, as you said, like one size fits all and silver
Right.
bullet.
Right. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. Because the way that a lot of conversations on the web kind of frame immutability is around ransomware, right? And I think the idea of immutability has been around for a while, but I feel like ransomware really brought it to the fore because, necessity, is often the driver behind a lot of new products. And the question I always see is like, hey, Immutability helps me solve the ransomware problem, right? Does it really protect my data from ransomware? And we've seen it time and time again where a ransomware gang will, infect a target organization with ransomware. And so often they're going out and searching within that infrastructure for the backups, right? So that the company can't recover from them, because I forget what the statistic was specifically, but I know in this last 12-month period, less and less organizations are actually paying the ransom than in previous years. So it's the percentage of companies paying the ransom has gone down. And I think there's a lot to do there with sanctions against Russia, because I know that a lot of ransomware gangs are based in Russia, and there's a lot of question about, like, paying money into, the Russian state, even via a ransomware situation, is legally a little questionable.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. So it's really dangerous for a company, like especially with all of these sanctions, and
Yeah.
like you have to tread water very lightly. And the thing is, as you were saying, with ransomware nowadays, there's a it's so common because there's a hell of an incentive for it. I mean, like ransomware as a service exists. You can go online, well, maybe dark web a bit, and without any expertise whatsoever, just as we provide like backup as a service, you can find your own ransomware as a service, and they'll do your branding for you, and they'll even host the wallet for you. All you need to do is provide them a Bitcoin wallet, and some there are some companies that even like design a campaign to infect people for you.
Right.
So there's a huge incentive, and as you said, like necessity is the mother of all invention. So it's just a never-ending sort of game of cat and mouse between security and essentially, I'm not going to say greed, but yeah, um, uh, hackers for greed.
Right.
So
I'm glad you brought that up, because you mentioning that ransomware as a service, and that kind of brings up the point that ransomware as a tool for threat actors has become more accessible than it ever has been. And I say that because of the big buzzword so far this year, ChatGPT, right? The advent of AI in our everyday society. We, Yvonne, Bernard, and I did an episode where we talked about ChatGPT. And for those of you watching or listening, I'll be sure to include a link to that episode in the notes here below. But we talked about the fact that we, in the security lab, we used ChatGPT to create functional malware. And basically, all we did is we said, there's a couple of ways that you have to get around the safety controls on the web UI of ChatGPT, but there's ways to do it. Or you can use the backend API. There's no filtration controls on the backend API, but it spit out functional ransomware. And so, I mean, it's enabling an entire new generation of threat actors who may not have had the skill needed to create their own ransomware. So I guess my point is there's more of it in the world today, right?
So I mean, okay. So I do see a use case. I do see a use case in that, but all right, there are controls put in place with ChatGPT and other AI models. The thing is, sorry, the dog's running around over here in the office.
Nah, it's fine. We like dogs on this show.
Yeah, we love dogs. So, with ChatGPT, to be honest, don't see it as much as designing ransomware, because like when they say like things are already factored into the market. So when you're investing in, I don't know, some random stock in Apple, most of the things that have been known about, sorry, most of the things that will move Apple's stock price up are already factored into the price. Like
Right.
everyone inside already knows that. So when we're talking about ransomware and ransomware created by these AI models, I think since it's scouring the internet and it's just finding and regurgitating stuff that's already known, anti ransomware providers, anti malware providers already know how to deal with this, because AI is just about patterns and trying
Right.
to like mix and match. Now, where I do see ChatGPT like being amazing in ransomware is, I mean, it's a language model, and with spear phishing campaigns. Now that's going to be really difficult
Yeah.
to control, because if I can point, instead of just sending out huge mass phishing mailer to 1,000 companies to 5,000 companies, trying to trick them. If I can have ChatGPT actually analyze this company, analyze the people who are working at that, get their information from LinkedIn, and then create its own spear phishing campaigns. Now that's really dangerous, and that's when AI
Yeah.
and ransomware like really start getting dangerous.
Yep.
And as you said, like ransomware is getting better and better on sort of on evading and on destroying backup sets and getting reconnaissance. So like I had recently seen our repositories being attacked, as well as some other big backup providers. Like Veeam is always gone after. Um, uh, ours are gone after. They basically it's one of the MITRE criteria for ransomware, that they go after backup folders, and
Right.
they go after what do you call it, shadow copies.
Yep.
So we had a hard time. I remember about 2 years ago, where Sentinel-1 kept on killing our backup agent because we were cleaning up our own shadow copies. So as a backup provider, we have to
Oh,
create our own shadow copies,
right.
and backups were confused for ransomware because of how advanced ransomware has gotten, in that it does 101 different things. That nowadays, all of that behavior, um, yeah, it can be really confusing to identify what's ransomware uh, at the pace it's evolving at.
Right. Oh, a lot of caveats, and it's just kind of becoming interesting. I struggle to say this. I really do. Ransomware has become very interesting in that regard, right? It's still a pain in the rear end. Don't get me wrong. Nobody likes ransomware, but it's just like any technology. And I struggle to call ransomware a technology, but when you get right down to it, it kind of is, I suppose. It's just interesting to see the evolution of it, right? And again, we've said it a couple of times, right? Necessity is the mother of creation. That's where immutability comes into play, right? And I wanted to bring up the ransomware discussion in this episode because when we're talking about immutability, you can't not talk about ransomware, right? So,
Yeah.
but with that in mind, are there benefits and use cases for immutability for data that is essentially non-backup data, right? So I was trying to think about this. I always hear about immutability through the context of a backup conversation. And I was trying to think the other day, like, okay, is there a use case where I would want immutability even for data that is not backup data? And I'm thinking, maybe I'm in a highly regulated industry where I need to write records that can never change, or maybe situations where I want to protect the chain of custody of data, to verify that the data changed hands or moved further in a process, and each step in the process is non-changeable. What about you? Is there situations that you can think of that maybe I haven't mentioned yet?
So, well, I'll get into the situations, but what you mentioned is exactly sort of one of the reasons why immutability became such a big thing, and it is used for ransomware a lot nowadays. But immutability and the whole concept of it came off of something that you and I are very familiar with. You more so because you're a bit older than me, but immutability comes from Worm. So
Right.
that's write once, read many, and that's the concept where we used to use RDX cartridges before,
Right.
and basically it in itself was a form of immutability, because you'd have a record of it permanently. You wouldn't be able to modify it. You could essentially write once, read many, and that's what immutable technology does as well. It's write once, read many. And the uses for worm before were in archiving, for example.
Right.
So as you were saying, like sensitive areas like accounting and legal, where I'll give you an example of Office 365, where in Office 365 you can set a legal hold, for example, on someone's mailbox and all of their data, so that it can be used in a case in the future. And this is the same thing with accounting firms and legal firms, and someone that has to keep like database records for 10 years, and they
Right.
can't be touched, they can't be modified. So before it was on Were Media, and I mean now we have more options, and there's also sort of the same worm concept, but with a new name essentially, and a bit more technology behind it, and that's Immutable.
Right. Right. Makes for an interesting market. So it's always interesting to me. Like you said, I'm a bit older, and I've been in the industry for, I dare say, I go on 20 plus years now. Good Lord, I'm getting old. but it's interesting how we go through these cycles, right? There's stuff that we used to do is now showing up in new technologies today, and this isn't the first time it keeps happening, but it's always interesting to see. So, yeah, so we kind of talked about what immutability is, what the use cases are, what's really driven it, and I mean, I guess at the block level, what's really happening with immutability? Basically, the file system is just saying, hey, we've written this block, and I'm not going to allow anything to change it unless it's under very extreme circumstances, I would imagine. Can you go into that just a little bit?
Yes, so it definitely depends on the storage provider, but mostly it is exactly that. It's not just the file system, but the at a lower level, the data, the blocks will be moved somewhere else, and well, basically you can't interact with that block at all. You can't write onto that block. But yeah, sorry. It's it's a bit lower than just file level permissions.
Right. So it's actually the storage provider that's controlling that access and determining, like, hey, this block, I've written it. We're not going to touch it now unless I believe there's roughly two different kinds, right? You either have a time
Yeah,
based, or there's like a tag based system, right? Almost like we
yeah.
talked about legal hold, right? Kind of a similar type situation.
So essentially, think of it like on every single block, there's a property, an immutable property,
Yep.
and you'll either have, for example, a retain until date
Yep.
with S3, with any S3 compatible storage. You'll have a retain until date, and that's like a time-based lock. So I can say like this block is untouchable, unchanged until tomorrow morning at 1 a.m. And you can set it 1,000 years in the future. And
Right.
there's also legal hold. As you mentioned, it's actually called legal hold. And over here, it's again a property on the block, and you can write your own tag. So you can it's just a string, and if that string exists in the legal hold property, then the block is untouchable. And you tell me why. Well, exactly as you said, like in the case of a legal case, I can identify 1,000 files, 1,000 blocks. I can
Right.
tag them all with the case ID, because maybe I'm a legal firm, and I have a lot of data and it's mixed up, different servers, different, and I can all tag them with different case IDs. And when the case is over, I can just say, okay, all of the files with case ID 123, remove the case ID, that's been resolved. We no longer need to like have them in an immutable state, and now they can be
Gotcha.
copied over, archived, or deleted. But essentially, like a firm would go in and have all of their files tagged by case, so that they can do cleanup and they can like keep in compliance standards.
That makes sense. That makes sense. So, knowing that, then it always begs the question. I've seen this question come up in online communities too. Like, okay, we've got this awesome technology and immutability and all these different options. What's to stop an admin from making a particular block or a particular chunk of immutable storage writable again? So I guess what we're talking about is like the case of a rogue admin, right? And you mentioned this a little bit earlier. I mean, at the end of the day, if you have a rogue admin that really wants to destroy data, they probably have access to your physical infrastructure if you have physical in-house infrastructure, and they're just going to walk in and probably pull a drive or two is really all it takes these days, right? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in fact, that's one of the main reasons, and I'll mention V9. That's one of the main reasons why with V9 we first wanted to go with like cloud storage level of immutability. So as you said, like especially the kind of customers that take backups using Hornetsecurity's backup, they're going to have a NAS in-house, they're going to have a SAN in-house, they're going to have like an offsite server with some kind of repository, but it's always a risk that your guy at the MSP, your sysadmin, can go and rip that out. With a cloud provider, it's a bit more difficult. There's a bit
Right.
more bureaucracy if you like have to convince some guy in a Microsoft data center to pull out a disk for you. I mean, he has to find the disk first,
which is a feat in and of itself, probably.
But yeah, as you were saying, sorry, I got lost.
No, you're fine. So we were talking about the bureaucracy inside of a cloud data center, and the fact that it's more difficult for a rogue admin to go destroy data inside of like an Azure or an Amazon S3 situation than it is for on-premises infrastructure, right? Because
yeah,
the example I always give in this situation is going back to my MSP days, we're sitting there one day and I think I was doing level 3, data center support at that point in my career. And the phones start lighting up one day like, oh, hey, all of our stuff is down. I'm like, okay, all right, let me walk into the data center and see what's going on. Like, see if, yes, your stuff is down, but why? Okay, I walk into the data center and one of our junior techs is sitting there with, a cart with a stack of about 20 drives on it. And, I'm like, what's going on with this customer's stuff? Like, oh, I'm decommissioning a SAN. I'm like, you sure you got the right one? And I still feel terrible for this tech, even today. But it started shutting down and pulling drives from the wrong SAN. So then it became a situation.
Double check, triple check.
Exactly. And it's like it became one of these situations like, okay, what order did you remove the drives in? Let's get these drives put back in the exact same order so that the volumes are all still there when we power this thing back online. Thankfully, we were able to do that. But anyway.
Nightmare fuel.
Right, exactly. But going back to your point,
next Halloween we'll do another horror stories.
That's a good one. That will have to go into the next episode for sure. But going back to your point about a cloud provider, like you said, there are levels of bureaucracy that you would have to go through in order for that to happen.
And not only that, but I mean, in reality, like all of these big cloud providers, they're banking on like level 4 data centers. Like
right.
The amount of redundancy and biometric protection and like guards and like it's to a whole different degree than what you'd be able to do with protection in-house. So I know that like one way of going about like immutability is okay, you can do it on your SAN, and then you just have to lock the server door and super duper, no one can access the server room. But other people are still using the SAN, so they can
Right.
maybe hack into the SAN because you haven't updated it to the latest firmware. God knows QNAP has like a different vulnerability every couple of months.
Seems to be.
Yeah, and Western Digital was hacked like I think like a month ago.
Yeah,
MyCloud,
that
but you
wasn't
wouldn't
that
use
long
MyCloud
ago.
for backup. Don't use MyCloud for backup.
We may be a bit biased, but I think that's
Yeah.
I think yeah.
But yeah, like some providers also, for example, recommend that you dump it on like a Linux box, and this will be a black box. It'll be stripped down. Only port 22 is open, and only for like so SSH, and only for one user. So basically, what you're doing is you're like hardening. You're doing security hardening of a very, very small OS, and you're reducing your
Right.
attack surface.
Right.
And that's still really good. It's a very good approach. But I saw that, yeah, there's still a vulnerability over there because you can still get to it with big cloud providers. Take Amazon, take Microsoft. Yes, they have a huge attack surface, but they have like tons of people like constantly monitoring and watching, and the best security stacks. Like obviously, because they're providing services to millions of people, they have to be the best of the best when it comes to protecting their own infrastructure.
Right.
So for the data centers, yeah, I'm okay saying like my immutable data is in Amazon data centers, and I can trust that no one at Amazon's going to pull out the disk, like I said earlier.
Right, because it would have to be like an Ocean's 11 situation for that to happen.
Yeah.
And well, at that point, we kind of mentioned it earlier. If somebody's that determined to destroy your data, well, it's well, it's going to be a bad day, I think. So. Well, Phil, you know, I know you're a busy guy. I want to let you get back to your day, and I appreciate you coming and sharing your insights on today's episode. We'll be sure to have you back. I know you're a wealth of information when it comes to a bunch of other topics too, so we'll be sure to have you back. So always good having you, my friend. And
thank you very much. I really had fun, and
yeah, definitely.
It's always fun having these conversations with you.
Yes. It's always a good time. I just wish we could do it in person over a beer, right? You know, that would be better. But in the future, we'll have to do an episode like that. So
yes.
And for those of you watching or listening, I really appreciate you being here. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to smash that like button, as they say, and go ahead and subscribe to the show. You can subscribe to our podcast on all the major podcast platforms. You can also find us on the web at hornetsecurity.com. We've talked about Hornetscurity VM Backup version 9 several times throughout the show. It does have immutability baked in, thanks to Phil and his team. And so I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well, in case you're interested in checking that out. Other than that, stay safe out there, everyone. Have a good day.